From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Pete Hegseth becomes the first of Donald Trump's cabinet nominees to face a confirmation hearing, denying accusations of sexual assault and alcohol abuse in a session with senators that lasted hours. We'll have highlights from the hearing and analysis from our political panel.
And we'll be joined by Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida for his take on the Trump transition and how the razor-thin House majority can enact Donald Trump's agenda.
And as the Biden administration works for a ceasefire in Gaza less than a week before the president leaves office, we'll discuss with Evelyn Farkas, executive director at the McCain Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine.
Thanks for being with us here on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Indeed, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. We went through it together on the early edition of Balance of Power. Quite the experience today for Pete Hegseth in an interview that the likes of which he has never seen before. 27 senators for the better part of, 4 hours by the time they were done.
Yeah, a grilling on matters of character, also on qualifications for the job to lead the Pentagon. And by and large, it really split down partisan lines. Republicans seeming more inclined to support his confirmation to be defense secretary. Democrats, not so much. And of course, Pete Hegseth himself had the opportunity to plead his case for why he should get to serve in this role.
He believes, and I humbly agree, that it's time to give someone with dust on his boots the helm. A change agent, someone with no vested interest in certain companies or specific programs or approved narratives. My only special interest is the warfighter.
That's where we start our conversation with Bloomberg's Natalia Drozdiak at the table with us here. Natalia, interesting exercise, as we said, for him. Democrats brought all the firepower that we expected. Alcohol abuse, sexual assault allegations, which, of course, he maintains his innocence in each of these cases here, along with his management style or a lack of management experience. But in the end, everyone seems to think he's confirmed.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway here is that despite the tough grilling from the Democrats, he's kept his cool for the most part, and he looks set to get confirmed. Mm-hmm.
Well, and when we consider the votes for that confirmation, the big one that we had questions about, at least at the onset, was Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa, who is not only a combat veteran herself, but a survivor of sexual assault. And she posed this question to Hegseth about women serving in the military during the hearing.
As Secretary of Defense, will you support women continuing to have the opportunity to serve in combat roles?
My answer is yes, exactly the way that you caveated it. Yes, women will have access to ground combat roles, given the standards remain high.
She obviously asked it in a less combative way, shall we say, than some of the other women who serve on this committee, members of whom did indeed serve in combat as women as well, including Senator Tammy Duckworth. But for all of the conversation around his views around women in the military, were anyone's minds actually changed by this?
Well, I think, just on Joni Ernst, she was the key member that we were all watching because she's a Republican senator, but her background as a military veteran and a rape survivor meant that what she has to say on this could really matter. And she appeared assuaged by Hegseth's reversal on previous comments saying that women shouldn't play a role in combat. And she also seemed assuaged by his pledges to take seriously concerns around sexual assault in the military. So I think, the fact that we didn't see any sort of strong pushback from her also reinforces his strong chances here. Jeanne
Shaheen, the senator from New Hampshire, again a Democrat, remarked on his 11th hour conversion. How many of these senators see it that way, and did he convince them otherwise?
Yeah, I think there was, a lot of tough questioning on that, whether, this was a genuine reversal. Shaheen, but then also Gillibrand pushed him on that.
Yeah.
It's hard to say whether they were convinced by that. In a way, whether the Democrats were convinced or not doesn't really matter, because if he has the Republican support here, he doesn't need the Democratic vote. And, as we were discussing, he didn't meet with any of the Democratic members ahead of the hearing, which is also telling that, they're not relying on them for confirmation.
All right, Bloomberg's Natalia Drozdiak, thank you so much. Now, day 2 of Senate confirmation hearings is set for tomorrow with high-profile nominees, including Marco Rubio for Secretary of State and Pam Bondi for Attorney General, scheduled for their moments in the hot seat. And joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove. So, Josh, when we're talking about not just those two, but Scott Bessent, who will come on Thursday, it does seem the slate at which we're looking for this week, most of them have an easier path ahead than Pete Hegseth.
Yeah, this is the low-hanging fruit part of the schedule, I would say. Look, I think the takeaway from today is that Republicans are very confident that they have the votes, not only for Hegseth, but for, if not the whole slate, darn near the whole slate. And so, President Trump has put a lot of pressure on it. We mentioned Senator Ernst, and of course, she did stick her head out on this question, a few weeks ago, when she herself was being rumored as an alternate candidate should Hegseth bow out or not be able to proceed. And she essentially fell back in line. It was clear that Republicans who were willing to really rattle the cage on some of President-elect Trump's nominees were going to face blowback from party faithful, including heavily on Elon Musk's social media site, Twitter, where Joni Ernst's mentions were complicated. So I think that the lesson was clear. I think the confidence factor is high. You can see it arguably in the faces of the Democratic lawmakers on this committee who just don't seem to be holding out much hope that the candidates, if they do oppose them, would actually be derailed. So this is, we're going through the motions with some of these folks, I think, a little bit. And, no one, for instance, thinks that there's a lot of risk for Bessent's nomination, for instance.
I have to ask you about the ERS, not to be confused with the IRS, that Donald Trump is talking about on social media here, an external revenue service. I thought we were getting rid of federal agencies, not adding them. How would this work?
Well, DOJ is a new federal agency.
Well, kind of.
Kind of. Yeah. I would actually put that in, we collect tariffs now.
Okay.
Right. There's a mechanism.
Customs and Border Protection.
Correct. So there's a mechanism to do that. Now, is this going to be a new department with, a building and staff and that? Doesn't seem so. We don't have a lot of detail on that, but the indication seems no. I don't think Bloomberg will be posting for a reporter to cover this full-scale department. Trump is a brander. I mean, his allies think that that's one of his sort of key strengths, of course, and so he is trying to draw attention to what is a looming fight. He wants to gain more revenue from tariffs and duties, and tariffs in particular. Of course, tariffs are not externally collected. They're collected by American importers. Now, some of the sellers offset that and eat some pain on their end. But ultimately, the literal person who pays the tariff to the U.S. government is the American company or person that imports that good. And so it's not all that external when it comes to tariffs. But nonetheless, Trump calls tariffs the most beautiful word in the dictionary. They have been very opaque on just precisely what tariffs they are planning on day 1 or day 2 or day 7. Our colleagues Jenny Leonard and Saleha Mohsen with some reporting this week on that there's a camp within Trump's orbit, not necessarily Trump himself, that is proposing a sort of scaled, ramped-up plan when it comes to tariffs. But I think the takeaway from it, it is kind of like DOJ, right? It's a label, and I stand to be corrected if they ultimately do try to put together some sort of department. Trump wants to focus the attention on tariffs. He wants to try to shift revenue to tariffs, which of course are ultimately borne by American consumers to some extent, and potentially away from income taxes, for instance. And, he talks about renaming Denali Mount McKinley, and McKinley was a big tariff president. He loves that. He's all in on tariffs right now. We're just waiting to see not only the fine print, but the bold print. They just haven't said.
Well, he's certainly got our attention and the market's attention. In the meantime, Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove. Thank you so much, Josh. Great to have you. Back at the table, coming up, Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida is going to join us. He'll be here live from Capitol Hill next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
very aggressive timetable for a lot of important things that we'll be putting into that legislation, as you know, and those discussions are ongoing. I would anticipate lots of specific and detailed questions about what's going to be on that. Let me just give you the answer right now. I'm not going to tell you, okay? This is internal politics and discussion and things that we are doing in reconciliation as the majority party, and we have to allow room for that to breathe.
House Speaker Mike Johnson a bit earlier today talking about his plans for one big reconciliation bill, or will it end up being two? No, Johnson says that's the goal, to have one vote on the one bill on the House floor by Easter. And joining us now live from Capitol Hill is Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Congressman, it's great to have you back. I know you always tell us what you think on this one, and everyone says, well, we need some direction. John Thune wants two, Mike Johnson wants one, Donald Trump doesn't seem to care. Does the president-elect need to put his foot down and say, this is how we're going to do this, and I need a vote by this date, say Easter?
No, I don't think so. I think that we're going to figure this thing out. Look, one bill or two bill, it really doesn't matter. It's about delivering the agenda. I think there are some key things that on Capitol Hill that have to be understood. Number one, we are going to reauthorize the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and some of the new pieces of tax policy that President Trump talked about on the campaign trail. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. We're going to find a way to get all that stuff done. I think the devil in the details is what do some of the mandatory reforms look like? Mandatory spending cuts, some mandatory spending reforms. What is that going to look like in the context of tax policy, energy policy, securing our nation's border, and getting our military in position to be the fighting force it needs to be for the challenges in the future? I think those are the constructs of what one bill or two bills will look like. And if we can accomplish debt ceiling in the process, all the better.
Well, Congressman, you just mentioned no tax on tips specifically, and I understand you're intending to reintroduce no tax on tips legislation as you did in the 118th Congress. I guess I just wonder, is it your intent that that particular bill gets rolled up into this ultimate reconciliation package, or are we going to actually see different changes to the tax code happening piece by piece rather than folded into one big package?
No, look, I mean, I'm going to reintroduce the legislation, and if my colleagues decide that they want to run it on its own, I'm all for it. But I do believe the reality is that it's probably going to be all a part of budget reconciliation. And look, I think the key thing is that the last time we went through budget rec, which is how we call it up here, to do tax policy, we created the very best tax policy in the history of the United States. We raised more revenue than ever before. We raised more revenue as a percentage of our economy than ever before. And we had the fastest and the highest growing economy we've had in more than 3 generations. So tax policy does matter. What matters just as much as tax policy are the regulatory reforms that have to happen in every agency at the federal level. All those things can be accomplished in budget reconciliation. So if it means that no tax on tips is a part of that package, I'm for that as well, because we have a responsibility to answer the call, the political mandate given to us by the American people.
Yeah, we did wonder if individual members like yourself, Congressman, might each kind of take a piece of this. You know, you take no tax on tips, I'll take no tax on overtime, and then maybe that helps to speed up the writing of a larger tax reform bill. But I want to ask you about the border. If this is, in fact, one big bill, the argument for two is to get something done on the border and energy right off the bat. I'm assuming you're going to talk to me about executive actions. We're hearing that President-elect Trump could take as many as 100, maybe more, EOs out with the Sharpie in the Oval Office on day one. Is that actually how Republicans will get to the border, and then you wait for the legislation until it's written?
I mean, look, the president's executive orders are going to happen regardless of what I think or, frankly, what anybody thinks, because he was elected, he has the mandate, and it was crystal clear from the voters of our country they want the border secured, and they want everything that Joe Biden did to be reversed. So that's number one. Number two, and I think this is the conversation around two bills, like I can do it both ways. The positive side of having two reconciliation bills is you address border security with the funding necessary for Tom Homan and his team to get the work done as soon as possible. You also can probably put some money up for defense to try to get some of our material in place that's necessary to help reform DOD, because, by the way, Pete Hegseth did a great job today. Fully expect him to be confirmed probably over the next couple of weeks. But you put those two pieces in place under budget reconciliation, you find ways to pay for those, rescinding former Biden spending, which is absolutely ridiculous anyway, and then we move forward to the broader package around energy and tax. Title 42
Do you want to see, though,
something...
Donald Trump... That's how you rip off the Band-Aid on the border, right? You get an EO on Title 42, and then you follow up with something more comprehensive. That's what's about to happen?
I'm not going to step in front of the president and what they're going to do. I'm going to let his team speak to the executive orders. I know for the funding necessary to start repatriating people back to their home countries, Congress is going to have to step up and provide that. It's one of the reasons why I think the Senate and some members of the House want to do two bills so you can address the border issues early. You can actually also address the Defense Department issues with the funding that they need. And I also believe you can address debt ceiling as well. Get that stuff done quickly, get it out of the way. You don't have to deal with Chuck Schumer in the Senate and Senate Democrats. You can get that done immediately, get the president some wins, and then we go through the long negotiations around tax policy, energy policy, spending reforms, etc.
Well, we heard from the incoming president today, sir, on something pertaining to revenue, not when it comes to taxes, but when it comes to tariffs. He says he's announcing he will create the External Revenue Service to collect our tariffs, duties, and all revenue that come from foreign sources. Congressman, we do currently have Customs and Border Protection for that. And if a new agency is to be created, it would require an act of Congress. Is this something you think we need?
We're open to any proposal from the President of the United States. And the reason why is because he's been sitting, frankly, for 4 years watching the mismanagement of our country. It gives you an opportunity to think outside the box. And let's be very clear. Let's not act like Washington, D.C. has been getting everything right for a long, long time. That is not the case. Washington has actually been wrong. Frankly, that's why I'm here. That's why Donald Trump was reelected, to fix this place. So if it means we think outside the box with something like the ERS, or it's like Doge. If we think outside the box, it is because it requires a new way of thinking on Capitol Hill. Giving new jobs to the same departments has not fixed this town. You might need to break some eggs, redo some of these departments, maybe open up a new one, which makes another one obsolete, and you get rid of that one. That's how you get monumental change, not just in government. That's how it's done in business all the time. Sometimes you got to shuffle the deck, and that's okay, as long as the customer, in this case the American people, get the biggest bang for their buck.
I know you're just settling into the 119th Congressman, and you're certainly behind Donald Trump and have been in every conversation that we've ever had from a policy, even a personality standpoint. But there's reporting out there that you hired a pretty famous pollster, Tony Fabrizio, and I'm wondering if that's to keep your seat in Congress or if you got your eyes on a gubernatorial campaign.
No. Look, when you have an ability to bring in great people and work with great people, that's what you do. Actually, I had a couple of my colleagues ask me about that, too. And I just said, listen, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. Right now, my mission is Donald Trump's administration getting the agenda done through Congress and doing everything we can to reverse the disaster of Joe Biden. But in terms of bringing Tony and his team on, listen, when you find great talent, you bring them in. Don't worry about future elections. As long as you stay ready, you don't have to get ready.
All right. Well, Congressman, when you do make decisions about your future, we hope you'll come back and share those with us. Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Always a pleasure, sir. Thanks for joining us. And still ahead, PPI data comes in cool ahead of tomorrow's CPI report. We'll have more on the inflation picture next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Thanks for joining us. The December Producer Price Index came in below expectations this morning, helping traders breathe a bit of a sigh of relief for the outlook of inflation and, of course, tomorrow's CPI report. Let's get to it right now with Bloomberg Economics' Estelle O. It's great to see you, Estelle. Thank you for joining us. This is going to be the last CPI while Joe Biden's in office. What's it going to tell us?
Yeah, so you're right, Joe. This morning's PPI print did come in softer than expected. We don't expect that to translate into tomorrow's CPI print. We're actually expecting headline CPI to accelerate to 0.44% versus 0.3% last month in November. And we're expecting the core to stay sticky at 0.3%. So it's not looking great.
Mm-hmm. Well, so when we consider the different components of it compared to what was putting the greater downward pressure on PPI than expected, part of that was food costs. So we should just kind of not pay attention to any of that in CPI.
Right. So
tomorrow.
It doesn't directly translate, unfortunately. Actually, one of the reasons why we're expecting acceleration in the headline is because of food and energy costs.
Mm-hmm. With that said, this won't be the last CPI reflecting Joe Biden's administration. There'll be another, of course, that follows once Donald Trump is in office. How would you describe the complete picture here when we consider 4 years of this administration fighting inflation?
Right. So throughout these 4 years, you've seen an acceleration in inflation throughout 2022, the Fed clamping down on that, and CPI, slowly falling, but nowhere near the Fed's 2% target. We expect that to likely continue into Donald Trump's first year. We're expecting, CPI to continue to trend slower, but end the year around 2.8% year over year at the end of 2025. Now 2.8%. You could be in kindergarten to know that that's above 2. That's going to be still a problem for the Fed. So we expect that to really continue on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so when we consider both the inflation and labor market data that the Fed will be looking at, when the market expectation does seem to be we're going to be holding for a while until something suggests the Fed should be doing otherwise. What is it that is likely to inspire that move one way or another?
Yeah. So right now, with this month's data, we've got, a hot labor jobs report last week that shows, the labor market may be stabilizing. Meanwhile, if our forecasts are correct, we're expecting inflation to, tick higher. So right now you got labor market seeming to stabilize, inflation trending higher. That's all probably going to give the Fed more confidence to, hold rates. And that's actually, we really see a risk for, rate cuts to be pushed back. So our baseline is still for the Fed to, cut rates in the first quarter. We still want to see more labor market data indicating that it's stabilizing. But so far, we do see real risk that, the Fed could be pushing back its rate cuts further to later this year.
All right. Estelle O of Bloomberg Economics, thank you so much for joining us. And I do wonder, Joe, especially given what we've heard from the president-elect about Fed policy and his views that rates are too high, if Scott Bessent is going to have to face some of those questions on Thursday in his confirmation hearing.
And then talk to us about phasing in tariffs while we're at it, as Bloomberg had reported, making it basically impossible for the Fed to forecast anything.
Yeah, so we're going to have to watch tomorrow's data and Thursday, of course, for more. In the meantime, still ahead, Pete Hegseth makes his case for defense secretary on Capitol Hill, and we'll have more on his confirmation hearing with Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There's not a single mention in this statement about Ukraine or Russia. Is this code for we're going to abandon Ukraine?
That's a presidential level policy decision. He's made it very clear that he would like to see a end to that conflict. We know who the aggressor is. We know who the good guy is. We'd like to see it as advantageous for the Ukrainians as possible, but that war needs to come to an end.
You talk a lot.
Defense Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth discussing Ukraine during his Senate confirmation hearing earlier today. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director at the McCain Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine. Evelyn, welcome back to Balance of Power. Obviously, over the course of hours, Pete Hegseth faced some pretty difficult questions, many of them related to his own character and conduct, a few of them related to the internal dynamics of the Department of Defense and the budget that comes with it. But did you hear enough from him today on the way in which he actually sees the U.S. military conducting itself abroad in relations with allies like Ukraine or in other theaters?
No, and in fact, it was really disappointing when one of the senators asked him about, what are the members of ASEAN, which is the Southeast Asian alliance or not alliance, but association of Southeast Asian states. He didn't really comment much. That was an opportunity. Actually, she asked him about whether the United States had special relationships with any countries in the region. He could have talked about the Philippines then. He could have talked about standing up to China, and he didn't. The portions of the hearing that I saw really, Kayleigh, were not focused on foreign policy.
Well, I guess I'm inferring from you that might be a disservice, because we did talk about a lot of other things, including some of the statements that he's made. For instance, Jack Reed brought this up, the ranking member, about ignoring things like the Geneva Convention, where we got a little bit of a taste of some of the things he had said in the past. But as Jean Shaheen called it, Evelyn, an 11th hour conversion. Was that enough for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the problem, that he's on the record. He's written 4 books. You know, he was a Fox host / commentator, you know, kind of in the opinion arena. He's said a lot of things about women in combat, opposed to it, frankly, opposed to women in the military. He's spoken out about the war crimes that were committed by special operations forces and supported President Trump in overturning the convictions and pardoning those people. Those are people who, mind you, were convicted by a jury of their peers and brought forward by their own special operations forces colleagues. So there were real questions about his understanding of the rule of law, of the rules governing warfare, human rights, the Geneva Conventions. We know we put them in place after World War II so that we wouldn't have torture. We would know that our troops and other troops would be treated with a certain basic human rights at the core. So there were a lot of topics covered, but not very much on foreign policy from what I could tell.
Well, so when we do consider some of these foreign policy issues, specifically this notion, and we've heard it suggested by Donald Trump repeatedly, that he would like to see an end to the war in Ukraine, as well as the war between Israel and Hamas. He wants the return of the hostages. He wants all these things to stop. To what extent is it going to be incumbent on Pete Hegseth to help make this happen? Or is that actually more going to be the charge of Marco Rubio, who's having his confirmation hearing tomorrow? Is it just going to be Donald Trump himself? To what extent should people really expect that Pete Hegseth is going to be a decision maker in this administration when it comes to some of these issues?
Well, Kayleigh, I've served 4 secretaries of defense, and the last 3, I was intimately involved in advising them on decisions that they were making with the President of the United States. So they made some of the decisions themselves. Some of them, they would take advice from myself in my office and carry that to the President and help the President make decisions. So those were Secretary Robert Gates, Secretary Leon Panetta, Secretary Ash Carter. Those 3 I served directly. I served Secretary Gates indirectly. Those gentlemen knew what they were doing when it came to foreign policy, and also the real importance of having a military that is ready to fight and win the nation's wars. And I think a lot of the questioning today got to that, because if President Trump is to be a credible negotiator, and the Secretary of State is an important part of this, the Secretary of State will have to go and negotiate. That's their main job for the administration. But in order to be a good negotiator, President Trump said it himself, hearkening back to President Ronald Reagan, it's peace through strength. That strength is not just economic and political, it's also military. If we have a military that is losing confidence, that is not ready because somehow there's a question about women in combat, or again, the rules of law, whether we're a moral and a principled military, all of those questions, if they're raised inside the military, how the military will be used, because those questions were also raised, whether the military would be used against American citizens for law enforcement purposes, which again is counter to the Constitution and the Posse Comitatus Act that our forefathers passed in order to keep our military out of internal domestic issues. So I would say there are a lot of issues there that the Secretary of Defense, was asked, well, not the Secretary of Defense, the nominee was asked about, and that any secretary would have to worry about in order to make sure the military is seen as ready and is actually ready to fight and win the nation's wars.
We're counting down. What do we have? 6 days, Evelyn, the rest of the Biden administration. And we do wonder what's left in the tank here as they hope for and work for a ceasefire. The administration is saying, the president himself said last night, they appear to be on the brink of something. We heard yesterday in conversation with Bloomberg's Jenny Leonard here at Bloomberg in the Washington bureau. Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, on this possibility between now and the inaugural. Let's listen.
I think the pressure is building for Hamas to come to yes. I think Israel also has achieved a huge amount of its military objectives in Gaza, and therefore they are in a position to be able to say yes. So there is a distinct possibility that we can get this deal done this week.
What are the chances of that happening, Evelyn, knowing as well that the Trump team is in the very same negotiation?
Yeah, actually, I think that, Joe, makes it more likely that there will be a deal because President Trump has put his kind of political influence and power, if you will, behind this. He sent his envoy. His envoy has been sitting in the meetings with our current diplomats, so with the Biden team. And President Trump has made it clear that when he comes back into office, he doesn't want this problem on his plate. Now, the current ceasefire and the deal doesn't mean that all hostages will be released. Perhaps all of the Americans among the hostages will be released, but President Trump will still have to deal with it. But I think he's putting good pressure, not just on Hamas. We have to remember that Hamas is ultimately controlled by Tehran, by the Iranians. So he's putting pressure there. And then, frankly, also on the Israeli government, on Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants to have a good relationship with President Trump.
Mm-hmm. Evelyn, it's good to have you back. Evelyn Farkas is Executive Director of the McCain Institute, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine. Thank you. Coming up, our political panel will be with us as they weigh in on the contentious hearing for Pete Hegseth today. Will he be our next Secretary of Defense? It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
What do you have to say to the almost 400,000 women who are serving today about your position on whether they should be capable to rise through the highest ranks of our military?
What's wrong with a mom, by the way? Once you have babies, you therefore are no longer able to be lethal?
You didn't reveal any of this to President Trump or the transition team. You didn't reveal the action. You didn't reveal the criminal complaint. You didn't reveal the criminal investigation. You didn't reveal the settlement.
I don't think there's a board of directors in America that would hire you as a CEO with the kind of experience you have on your resume.
How can we ask these warriors to train and perform the absolute highest standards when you are asking us to lower the standards to make you the Secretary of Defense simply because you are buddies with our president-elect? You, sir, are a no-go at this station.
There's a 32-day period in which you suddenly have another description about your views of women in the military. Now, I've heard of deathbed conversions, but this is the first time I've heard of a nomination conversion.
Democratic senators questioning Donald Trump's pick for defense secretary during a rather contentious Senate confirmation hearing earlier today. Of course, Pete Hegseth is that nominee. And joining us now, our political panel for the evening, Adam Hodge, managing director at Bully Pulpit International, our Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie, founder and principal at Blue Stack Strategies. Great to have you both here. I'm not sure, Adam, your thoughts on where this goes, but everyone's telling us that Pete Hegseth has the votes. What was the purpose of the exercise? Did Democrats make any difference today?
Well, two things happened today that I think are worth noting. One, John Curtis at an event earlier today expressed his reservations about a number of President Trump's national security picks. And so there's some question about the math of whether will get
Is this not
the 50 votes. I don't think it's a done deal quite yet. But the thing I took a step back and remembering, yesterday I had the privilege of being at the State Department for President Joe Biden's last foreign policy speech. And I saw, Secretary Lloyd Austin sitting in the front row. A man who served with distinction for 4 decades, commanded troops in Iraq, Afghanistan. The split screen between him and Pete Hegseth could not be any greater. I mean, Pete Hegseth is barely qualified to run a lemonade stand, let alone the Department of Defense with 3 million people, $850 billion budget. So I think there are fresh questions today, and Tammy Duckworth at the end nailed it. He's not qualified to serve as Secretary of Defense, and questions about whether he has the judgment and experience to do the job remain for a number of senators, and I think some still on the Republican side.
Well, he, of course, is a veteran himself. He, too, has served this country, Adam, and many senators did thank him for that today. Maura, as we consider that what Adam was just speaking to, this notion that maybe he does not have the qualifications as defense secretaries of the past, Donald Trump didn't necessarily have the same resume as American presidents before he was elected the first time and again the second time. And this is who Donald Trump chose. The American people elected Donald Trump, and this is his will. So for that reason, do you think the Senate is going to give him what he wants on this one?
I think when it comes to Pete Hegseth, I see that nomination going through pretty easily, in large part because you're right, the standards have changed. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but they have. And so many times today you heard Democrats questioning Pete Hegseth about his marital status. And so for things that do not have to do with the job of Secretary of Defense, and unfortunately, that was one of the bigger sound bites you heard. And I think it loses the point of this election. The American people voted for change. They voted against being told, this moral superiority that so many in the Democratic Party have positioned themselves to be. But to me, today's hearing also just showed a disarray of Democrats. There's no leadership. They didn't have a very concise message, because if they had, to Adam's point, focused solely on his lack of experience in managing such a large department and such a large budget, they would have had probably more success. Unfortunately, they chose to go all over the map and hit so many times on his personal life that didn't really amount to much today.
His personal life, also some other statements that he's made in a series of, as we know, books that he's written, interviews that he's conducted. Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii got to some of these in this exchange with Pete Hegseth. For instance, how far he would go if ordered by Trump.
Would you carry out an order to shoot protesters in the legs?
I saw 50 Secret Service agents get injured by rioters trying to jump over the fence, set the church on fire, and destroy
a statue. That sounds to me that you will comply with such an order. You will shoot protesters in the leg.
She was just answering the questions for him that he wouldn't answer. Interesting style by the senator. Do we believe that about Pete Hegseth?
I think if he couldn't answer those questions, I think it raises real questions about whether he would have the judgment, independence, and leadership to stand up to the president and say, Mr. President, I don't think that's a good idea, as many of Donald Trump's secretaries of defense did in his first administration. Time and again, whether it was about the credible allegations of sexual assault, whether it was about his inability to run the two veterans organizations, whether he would continue to actually uphold the standard of the rule of law and the Geneva Convention of the way our troops conduct themselves in combat. The reason it matters is because who the Secretary of Defense is sends a message to the troops of what's okay. And I think he, by the answers he gave today, sends a signal to many of the rank and file that it is okay to torture, that it is okay to commit sexual assault, that it is okay to run the department and run an organization shoddily and managing the finances. So that's why I think the questions today were so powerful. And I think it's incumbent upon the senators of the Armed Services Committee to question whether they actually should give him a vote.
I'm glad, Adam, that you raised this notion of whether or not the Secretary of Defense and the president are going to butt heads at all, or if this potential secretary would be willing to do that. It was raised, Maura, in the hearing today by, I believe, Senator Peters, that we saw 5 either confirmed or acting secretaries of defense during the first Trump administration. If he's able to be confirmed, what is Pete Hegseth going to need to do to stay in the job? To stay in the job, does he have to just follow the orders of the commander-in-chief without question?
That's largely why Donald Trump chose him. It's not a surprise to anyone who's watched Donald Trump's first term and then watching who he appointed or nominated, this time around. He was looking for people who were going to follow his orders and do the job that he wants them to do. Being loyal to the commander-in-chief, that's not a negative. But at the same time, these positions are the reason we have these confirmation hearings is because the Senate wants to know that you're going to uphold your oath to do the job that you are raising your right hand to say that you will do. And that's not necessarily always dependent upon who the person is at the top. It is what's the well-being of the country and of that department. And so, but I think in this case, those are the standards that we have had for decades, right? That is the idea that we have all subscribed to and believe in, but they've changed. The standards have changed with Donald Trump being in the White House. And I look forward to a day where we can respect our institutions and respect our oaths. But in this new normal, the standards are not the same, and pretending as though they are and harping on questions that aren't getting answers to, will he do the job and how will he do the job, it was a missed opportunity by Democrats today.
All right, well, Pete Hegseth has had his turn. We have many more to go this week with Marco Rubio on deck tomorrow. Adam Hodge and Maura Gillespie will be sticking with us. It's still ahead. We take a look at the Department of Justice and Jack Smith's report on January 6th. Our political panel weighs in next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Jack Smith and the Department of Justice had access to more grand jury transcripts and information than the January 6th committee did. But the facts remain that President Trump intimately was part of the election interference. What the January 6th committee did is we raised those facts and put them in a report that the former president and incoming president is not happy with. Now the public will have a more thorough report as a result of Jack Smith's documents being released.
California Congressman Pete Aguilar and chair of the House Democratic Caucus discussing the release of Special Counsel Jack Smith's report on the Trump 2020 election subversion case. Came out just after midnight. And back with us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel, Adam Hodge and Maura Gillespie. So, Adam, Jack Smith has actually left the Department of Justice already. He retired without much fanfare, but we do get this as the final drop, if you will, knowing Donald Trump is not going to continue to be actively prosecuted for these alleged crimes. Jack Smith maintained in this that he was sure a conviction would result if we had seen this go through the process. But what does it matter now?
Oh, I think it matters for not only history, but I think it matters for how the Department of Justice conducts itself going forward and the standard that it sets. I mean, let's take a step back here. Jack Smith was very clear as a prosecutor that I believe there's evidence to support a conviction. That is the standard that all prosecutors have. I think there's a larger thing going on here, though, about the independence of the Department of Justice and the politics seeping into the way that legal cases are resolved. And it's relevant beyond just DOJ, but to the Federal Reserve. I'll posit that the politicization of the way the Supreme Court has thrown its thumb on the scale of precedent raises questions that if Donald Trump were to decide I'm firing Jerome Powell at the Fed, it's precedent and the law seems to indicate that they should not fire, that the president does not have that authority. There's a lot of questions now whether that would uphold and whether that would still be the case if he did, in fact, go forward with that. And that's, I think, some of the underlying legal issues that I've been watching over the last few days.
You know, jumps off the page, Maura, the special counsel's report, but for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. I realize that this trial is not going to happen here, but we actually have the rest of Donald Trump's national security team and others who will go through confirmation hearings the way Pete Hegseth did today. Should this be brought forth to Tulsi Gabbard, to Kash Patel, for instance, for their reaction?
You know, when we look back at leaders and people who have had positions of power, we tend to look more fondly on them in hindsight, right? Hindsight is often 20/20. I think in the case of Donald Trump, January 6th will forever be tied to his legacy. And it will also have changed the way that we, conduct business as far as where we hold the bar of what's appropriate, what's tolerated, what's acceptable. The bar is gone. And it needs to, January 6th cannot be just glossed over. It cannot just be forgotten. Yes, a conviction and a trial is not going to happen for Donald Trump. But for what happened that day and the things that led up to it, as the January 6th committee and this report also shows, it should absolutely be questioned upon people who are taking positions that would impact what the DOJ does or the FBI does, and when it comes to an insurrection that happened. It was such a monumental day, and I know for so many that they didn't feel the direct impacts, but for those of us who were close to it, but it should jar everyone. It should appall everyone, whether you're Republican or Democrat. It's not something just to be ignored, and I think that this report matters for history and for the legacy impacts of how we would look back on a Trump presidency.
Republicans and Democrats can agree on that.
Yeah.
At least that's one thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Can we end it on that note?
We'll keep searching for more where that came from. Adam Hodge and Maura Gillespie, we thank you for a great conversation and a great panel, and encourage you, as always, if you want to follow up on the stories that we've been talking about and analyzing here tonight, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online.
And, of course, you can find us back here tomorrow with more on the latest on these confirmation hearings in the Senate. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State nominee, will be next. Of course, he's seen as one of the ones who has the easiest path forward. The same can't be said for everyone.
And join us for a special tomorrow evening as Joe Biden says farewell to the nation. He'll be speaking from the Oval Office at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll see you back here on Bloomberg TV and radio.